The empire stood at a precipice, shackled by archaic laws that demanded cruelty over compassion. Landon Barn, a man from a world of modern logic, had joined forces with Henry to dismantle the rot at the heart of Despised. They sought to end the reign of fear, preparing to challenge not just a system, but the very brothers and uncles who would burn the empire to ash to claim its throne. Landon revealed the horrific truth of the chimney cleaners, a secret hidden behind the architecture of Despised. These children were mere tools, pushed into suffocating, soot-filled labyrinths until their bodies broke. The cruelty was absolute, a reality Landon refused to let continue, promising a future where humanity was valued above convenience. Far from the reforms of the UN, the royal palace of Despised was a den of vipers. Prince Ulrich, the crown prince, sat in his cold, lavish isolation, feeding on his ambition while his father lay dying. He was a man of steel who viewed the world as his chessboard, waiting for the final moment to solidify his grip on the throne. Meanwhile, the volatile Winston Tudor burned with a different fire. Humiliated and furious, he lashed out at everything in his path, his lack of restraint defining his dangerous, chaotic character. He saw himself as the true heir, fueled by envy and a thirst for violence that terrified his own retinue. As night fell, the time for diplomacy vanished. Operation Midnight was set in motion. With precision that contrasted sharply with the chaotic greed of the princes, Landon and his forces prepared to strike, moving like shadows under the cover of darkness to secure their foothold in the capital. They took to the skies, defying the limitations of their era. Hovering above the city like silent watchers, they held the key to the empire's fate. The silence of the night was about to be shattered, as the disparate forces of Despised were finally forced to face the consequence of their cruelty. On the ground, the rescue mission began. Vincent and his unit moved through the enemy camp with calculated audacity, blending into the crowd of arrogant knights. They weren't just soldiers, they were liberators, carefully extracting the women who had been trapped in a life of perpetual agony. The plan was simple but daring, turn the enemy's own arrogance against them. As the women donned disguises, the soldiers created a diversion, slipping past the gate as if they belonged. The first stage of their mission was nearing its end, and the camp was about to ignite. Phase 2 was the thunder of war. The silence of the abandoned merchant post was ripped apart by the roar of explosions. Landon's artillery tore through the defenses, shattering the false sense of security the princes had built. The pride of the Despised knights was reduced to smoke and debris. Commander Holt stood amidst the devastation, watching his forces vanish under an onslaught they couldn't even see. He had expected a battle of swords and valor, but instead, he was met with the cold, absolute superiority of Baymardian technology. His confusion quickly turned to raw, primal terror. The iron beasts rolled forward, crushing everything in their path. There was no glory here, only the swift end of an era. The Despised knights, so confident in their martial prowess, were rendered obsolete in minutes. The pride they held was their undoing, leaving them helpless before an unstoppable force. Holt was lost in the storm of steel and fire, his arrogance dying with him on the cold ground. He had tried to lead to strike back, but he was nothing more than a ghost in the path of the future. The battle of the merchant post was over, and the path to the palace was clear. Operation Midnight had reached its conclusion. The threat outside the city walls was dismantled, and the stage was set for the final act. Landon and Henry surveyed the carnage, knowing that tomorrow would decide whether Despised would rise or fall under the weight of its own greed. Inside the palace, the sun rose on the final hours of King Julius. He was a shadow of a man, his life drained away by poison he never suspected. Around him, the princes and princesses circled, their tears nothing more than a performance for the audience of nobles who stood ready to shift their allegiance. With his final breath, the king spoke, shattering the dreams of those who thought themselves chosen. He named Ulrich as his heir, a verdict that acted as the final match dropped into a powder keg. The room, already stifling, became a powder keg waiting for a single spark. King Julius Tudor was gone. The transition of power had begun, and with it, the facade of peace collapsed instantly. The mourning was short-lived. In this palace, sorrow was a luxury no one could afford, as the fight for the crown began even before his body was cold. The masquerade ended the moment the king passed, the hall filled with the tension of impending slaughter. Ulrich, Winston, Bonnevier, and the dukes all stood their ground, their forces emerging from the shadows. The struggle for the throne would not be a debate, but a war to the death. The brothers turned their blades on one another, their shared bloodline meaningless against the lure of the crown. Ulrich and Winston moved with the desperation of men who knew only one could survive. It was no longer a struggle for succession, but a fratricidal frenzy that mirrored the empire's own internal decay. One by one, the contenders fell. Duke Bulkington, the old viper, was struck down by his own nephew, his life ending on the cold marble floor. The old guard was being purged by the very youth they had tried to manipulate, proving that in Dafris, power favored the most ruthless, not the most entitled. Eldora, having dreamed of ruling, found herself trapped in a nightmare of her own making. She had underestimated the brutality of the men she called brothers, and her incompetence in the face of true violence left her vulnerable. Her ambition, once sharp, was now a dull, useless blade. Eldora fell, but she did not go alone. Her final arrow found its mark, dragging Joffrey into the abyss with her. One after another, the heirs were struck down, turning the Grand Hall into a tomb for a dynasty that had devoured itself from the inside out. Only 3 remained: Ulrich, Winston, and Duke Oges. The air was thick with the copper scent of blood, and the hall was littered with the bodies of those who once sought the crown. The end was near, and only the final blow would decide who would inherit the throne of a crumbling empire. The cycle of violence was reaching its conclusion. No more schemes, no more feigned loyalty, only the final, brutal reckoning. The empire's future depended on the survival of one, and as they stood among the ruins, the true nature of their bloodline was exposed for all to see. While the princes destroyed themselves, the city waited. They didn't know that the very walls that held their authority were becoming the site of their final, bloody testament. The royal family of Dafris was a cancer, and this day was its long-overdue surgery, executed by the heirs themselves. Landon watched from the perimeter, a silent witness to the self-destruction of the Tudor house. He had not needed to strike the final blow. He simply provided the circumstances for the tigers to devour one another. It was almost time to step into the wreckage and begin the task of rebuilding. The hall fell silent, the screams replaced by the hollow echo of steel on stone. The Game of Thrones was nearing its finish, but the winner would find that the chair they sought was now surrounded by those who had come to build a better world. The era of the Tudors had ended, and the era of the United Nations had begun.